Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know now, because we are in our 31st season, I talk to writers about their craft, what they're working on, what they've produced in the past, what they're planning for the future. It's a wider net than writers, however. We have had on sculptors, we've had on musicians, we've had on painters, actors. So if you have an idea for an artist, a writer or other brand of artist who might be a good fit for the writer's block, watch for our address at the end of the show. We'd be very happy to get your suggestions. I also want to remind you that the Writer's Block and all the other original programming that comes out of 1623 Studios is a result of cable access television. It's a valuable community asset, and you don't get it if you go away from cable for your internet sources. So watch the Writer's Block, stick with the Writer's Block, stick with cable. Tonight, I'm very happy to say we do have an artist, a novelist by the name of Barbara Boudreau. Barbara, welcome to the Writer's Block, or welcome back to the Writer's Block.
Thank you. Very, very happy to be here.
I said welcome back because you were on the show in the season of 2014-15 talking about a novel you had just written or just published at that time called The Frenchman. And I want to, if you would just give us a little background in case our audience might have forgotten a couple details in those 5 years, give us a little précis, a little summary of what that first novel, which set up the second novel, was about.
Well, okay, so the main character in this book is Jean Lachance, and he is a professional thief, for lack of a better term,
Yeah.
and pulls a job in Los Angeles. He has run away to Los Angeles to escape the French authorities and is hiding out in Los Angeles because he has some contacts there. And he together with a ne'er-do-well pull a job, and they plan to rendezvous at this spot in the desert, not too far from Joshua Tree National Monument. And at that location, he's waiting for the antagonist, Dewey Jensen, to show up. But what ends up happening is that he meets Dewey's girlfriend and her 3 kids, and they form this relationship, and then something happens and she ends up leaving with all the money, unbeknownst to her, and then so he is in pursuit of her. And this story just unfolds from there.
This is Lily.
Yes.
Lily and her.
Lily Parsons,
and
yeah.
her kids. Now,
Yeah.
that was The Frenchman and your new
Yes.
book, and I'm going to hold this up right now, and we're going to also put in a digital picture of Death of the Frenchman so that everybody can race out and buy it. It's an exciting book. It moves right along. Before we get into that, I'd like to talk, I love talking about the nuts and bolts of writing. You have a brief writer's notes paragraph in the beginning of your book, and it talks about your own challenges in producing this book, because books and poems and stories for papers just don't fall out of the air, do they? Can you tell us something about those writer's notes and your work in putting together The Death of the Frenchman?
Well, the Frenchman was, it wasn't the end of the story. That's the way I always felt about it. And it really deserved a sequel. You know, what happened to them? What did they do? They got back together and all of this, but what did they do from then on? And so in 2012, this is going back quite a ways, when before I had even published The Frenchman, there is the NaNoWriMo, the National Novel Writers Month in November every year, coming up, that you challenge yourself to write a 50,000 word novel in 30 days, which is something like 1,600 words a day. And I was, at that very time, I was recovering from back surgery. And so I was at home, and I also had my mother who had Alzheimer's living with us. And so I was just at home, and I had heard about the NaNoWriMo challenge. I mean, it's not a contest, you don't get anything, right? It's just a challenge that you make for yourself. And so I thought, I'm gonna write the sequel to this book. And so that's what I did. And I made the challenge. I wrote 50,000 words within that month. And the book ended up being, I think, 64,000 words or something, which doesn't really mean that much.
For our viewers, how many pages, how many typed pages is 1,600 words?
1,600 words is about 4 pages, something like that, double spaced, I think.
Oh, really? Yeah, maybe even more.
I would really have to think about that. For a writer, that is not a difficult thing for a writer. It's just, requires discipline. And of course, sometimes I would get behind, and then I would have to catch up, and write 3,200 the next day. But this is not edited, finished kind of text. This is just writing the story, right?
So kind of automatic writing, inspiration to the fingers.
Right.
Directly.
And I really love to write very extemporaneously. I mean, I don't outline. I have a plan in my head, but I don't vector out all the details. I find that really confining. And I think in my mind, for me, that becomes a better product in the end, because it really kind of mirrors real life, where you come to a crossroads and then you decide which way you're going to go. So I hadn't planned it out. We can talk a little bit about the story and where they were and what happened, but yeah, that all kind of came.
Well, I'm curious to know if you had planned the ending, because this is the title, The Death of the Frenchman, and the Frenchman dies in a very clever way. And I'm not going to reveal any spoilers here, but was the conclusion in your mind when you started?
No, because I didn't have a title. And the title was painful to arrive at. I was calling it the sequel for several years. Because I wrote the bones of it in 2012. So obviously that was a long time ago, and I didn't publish it until 8 years after the fact, but well, 7.5, whatever. But I finally decided to just go out on a limb and arrived at the title Death of the Frenchman. I thought it might be compelling enough to make people pick the book up. Yeah.
I think it's a good title. You have to read till he dies, because of the title. You're in suspense from the title page through the book.
Almost the end, yeah.
Yeah, almost the end. Not even the first paragraph, it's on the title.
Yeah.
One of the things we talked about before we began the show was I was asking you about your locations. You have some exotic locations in here, in the Caribbean, in the West, in the desert, the American West, the desert. So we bounce around from Caracas to Tucson to LA. It's kind of like a James Bond novel where there are all these exotic locations. What's the importance of location, which is very important in this book? What is the importance to you as a writer of location?
Yeah, location is key. So the whole desert idea, what I needed for that setting was isolation. And as we talked about before, I used to live in Montana years ago. I lived in Montana for 10 years, and it just wasn't isolated enough, and it wasn't in close proximity enough to a big city, which I also needed. So that's kind of how I ended up with desert. And I have lived in the desert in Idaho in 1980, and it was surprisingly alive. You know, we think about a desert as being empty and bleak and all of that. And a desert is actually amazingly alive with wildlife and all of these local resident, animals that are very fit for living in that location. But it also gives you the feeling of being cut off from civilization. Like all the movies you can think of where somebody's like slogging across the desert and how dangerous it is and everything. So that's the image that I wanted to portray. The Caribbean part of it, we went sailing for years and years, winters in the Bahamas. And so I was very familiar with that kind of environment, although we didn't actually go to this totally fictitious location in the book. Totally fictitious. There is no real place like that I am aware of. I use Google Maps and everything, and I kind of tried to get the location. The other thing about location is that you have to be accurate about travel time, about proximity to other places. So it can't be this fake thing that, you have to kind of make that part of the story real. But what I like about the Caribbean and my experience with the Caribbean is that it often is a place that people go to hide. And they can go to kind of an isolated out location and leave their other life behind, leave their, identity behind. And so it made not only an idyllic setting that was very forgiving weather-wise year-round, but also a place where they could escape to and hide.
And they do. They do escape and hide. I wanted to ask you about maybe the most important thing in a book are the characters, Jean LaChance and Mr. Santino, who's chasing him and chasing him and chasing him, and then because of the surprise ending, that changes. Can you tell us how you conceived of the Frenchman himself, LaChance, and Santino?
Well, I think it's probably in the author's notes at the beginning in the first book. I am not sure. But my image of this man, Jean LaChance, came from the French actor Jean Reno, not only physically the way he looked, but also the way his characters are often portrayed, that kind of mysterious, quiet, intelligent, tough character who kind of is an individual, goes his own way, doesn't need other people, that kind of thing. I just find that character really compelling. Like, this is the kind of character that people wouldn't necessarily want to know, but they're really curious about. How does a person like this exist, They don't have family, they don't have any kind of support group, they're just, this independent person. Guy Santino, on the other hand, is, he needed to be a non-Caucasian because it was LA, and I thought that was fitting.
Yes.
But also he needed to be an honest guy that was really just sick and tired of the establishment. And so that part of his persona gave him permission to pursue this guy way beyond the time that he should have stopped.
Yeah,
It became an obsession. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know, I think it's pretty clear in the book too that he admires him greatly. He knows that this is his foe that probably is of a larger skill set than Santino. So this was kind of a personal challenge for him, you know, but he was compelled. He needed to know this person. He needed to meet him, which then if you go to the kind of the last part, the scene, he kind of walks into it a little bit blind and unprepared, just because that then becomes his goal, is to meet him, not necessarily apprehend him, but
they are very much alike and kind of counterbalance in their counter punching. I wonder if there's a section of the book, a paragraph perhaps, that you could read us to give a sense of the book itself, or perhaps one of the two central characters. Just a sample paragraph.
a sample paragraph.
I didn't warn you about that. I should.
Yeah, I'm sure that this is a possibility. Oh yeah, if I can find it. One thing that I do is I really bring the personality of the boys out a lot more in this book, and they're very, very important to the story, although they're not really front and center so much. Boy, I don't know if I can find something right on the fly.
Well, maybe.
Okay. Let's try this. Santino, I'm sorry.
What page are you on, Barbara?
I am on page 46.
Okay.
Santino was torn apart with envy for the man who was his prey. Wasn't that true love? Sacrifice, trust, and not the trust signified by spitting or mixing of blood. This was no show. The two of them had displayed blind trust with no guarantee of resolution. The woman had sacrificed her freedom for that man, and by her own choice. LaChance had simply walked away. 6 months later, Lily and the kids disappeared. Santino was certain they had joined him. Lily was pregnant. The child had to be LaChance's.
Good choice of paragraph.
That was an accident. Thank you.
Application and a lot of teasing, suspense teasing there in that paragraph, which ends is close to the end of chapter 9. And I can't go to the end. Is an exciting finish. I can't talk more about it because I don't want to blow anything.
Yeah, that would be a terrible spoiler. I've actually had people react very badly to that title. And it just kind of makes, I mean, you know, sort of, it makes me kind of laugh. A lot of people have said, I just slowed down at the end. I couldn't stand it, you know, that this was going to happen. So yeah, it was fun. That was fun. And that was not planned. But as I was writing it, and I knew they had to come to a resolution. I knew they had to meet Santino and LaChance at some point in time. But I also had to end the story. This story will not go on. I've thought about it. I've thought about, you know, trying to bring it up again, sort of years later, and with Henry as the protagonist, but I think this story is done, and I had to end it. So that's why it ended the way it did.
Well, it's a good ending. I recommend it to all our viewers. I want to
Thank
ask, you just hinted at moving on from the Frenchman book and the death of the Frenchman. What are you thinking about doing in the future as a writer?
Well, I already have about 25 to 30,000 words written on. It's a memoir of sorts. And I hate to say that memoir. I really don't have that burning desire to write a memoir. To everyone who lives their own life is normal. But then when I look back on it, I'm probably living a more normal life right now than I ever have before. And I have been in many very interesting places and on a lot of kind of not really risky, but maybe unwise adventures. And I needed to write all that down. I needed to sort of relive that. And so I've got a book coming about wanderlust and what that gives us for individuals who have it and where it leads us and what kind of life is possible because of it. I think everybody gets so caught up in, wow, I need to go to college and I need to graduate and I need to get a job and I need to buy a house. And I've heard so many youngish people say, wow, I wish I had done that and this and the other thing, because they have some regrets, about what they've chosen in their life because of either self-imposed goals or goals that are placed on them by other people, parents or colleagues or whatever. And this is kind of a, story about you could do this too. And a lot of people have been encouraging me to write all this down. I worked on foreign fishing boats in the Bering Sea, and I've been on, skiing adventures in Montana, and I worked on a salmon study in Alaska and traveled throughout Southeast Asia. And then I did my master's field work in Africa. And a lot of that is doable. You just have to do it. Both of my parents were travelers. They didn't marry until quite late in life for that time in our, history. My dad was a missionary in Africa, and my mom, as a young woman in the 50s and even the late 40s, did a lot of extensive traveling, like took a ship across to Europe. And we always traveled when I was a kid. We always took vacations and traveled and went out west and came out east from the Midwest. And so to me, getting on a plane and going somewhere has never been any kind of a scary thing. It's just, I love going someplace new.
I think,
And
excuse me, go ahead.
no, my husband watches Joseph Rosendo's Travel Scope all the time. And at the end, he says, travel is fatal. Mark Twain says, travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness. And I think that is so true.
Yes,
The more people you meet who are unlike yourself, the better this world will be.
yes.
And now here we are again having big race problems and everything in the United States. And it's just heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking.
Yes. I forgot to ask again, although I asked you when you were on the show first, where were you born, Barbara?
I was actually born in Chicago, and I was raised in Kansas. And then we moved to Illinois and Indiana, and then I moved out to Montana. So Gloucester was my 40th move.
How did you settle on Gloucester?
My husband brought me here.
Is he from Gloucester?
Yes, originally he was. Both of his parents were from Gloucester, and then he lived away for some time. He was a road musician. He's a drummer for some time. His name is Al Boudreau, by the way. And he brought me here, and I will never, ever forget it. It was May of 1995, and we drove down into town, and I actually remembered the exact scene. We came down Angle Street, right, towards St. Peter's Square, and the forsythia and magnolia were all in bloom. And I saw the boats, and I just went, I want to live here the rest of my life. And that feeling for me has never changed in 25 years.
That happened to me a little earlier. I got here in the 70s, but the same kind of sensation. And I hear that from other guests and other people who are not native to Gloucester. I'm still considered a foreigner. I've only been here 45 years. But I understand that because I fell in love with the city too, and still am in love with it. I just noticed the clock, Barbara. We're very close to our time.
Okay.
A fast half hour. I want to thank you again for being on the writer's block for a second time to talk about the death of the Frenchman, your new novel, which I really enjoyed and I have to recommend. And yes, the wonderful, wonderful, catchy title, which makes the ending very, very exotically kind of catchy and ironic. So thanks for being on.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been my pleasure.
You're very welcome. I want to thank everybody in our TV audience as well for being with us on the writer's block. If you've learned something about character and location and novel writing and how many words you have to produce to get a decent novel out from Barbara Boudreau, then the writer's block has done its job. Thanks very much for being with us, and I hope to see you again next week on the writer's block. Good night.